citizen engagement for climate action. The way we're going to run the session today is we're going to have 3 organisations do a short presentation, then we'll stop a little bit for questions and discussion, and then we'll have another 2 organisations, and then we'll have a bit longer to talk about your experiences of citizen engagement in supporting the transition and the sort of challenges that you have. So we'd like you to be thinking about that through the presentations, for you to bring that as a kind of conversation. So we want your experience and your context as well in those sessions. So I'm Carly McLaughlin. I am the Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and an Associate Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation. We're also delighted to have collaborated on this session with the Maurice J. Wask Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. And we're also delighted to be joined by additional partners on the panel today. So I'll introduce each of those as they come to speak. But the first is Stuart Capstick, who is Deputy Director for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST. And the focus of CAST is to research and develop the social transformations needed to produce a low-carbon and sustainable society. So I will hand over to Stuart now.
Oops. How does this work? There we go. Hello, everyone. Yes, as Carly said, my name is Stuart. I work with the CAST Centre and also very active with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. So my job as the first speaker here today is to spend a few minutes just outlining the general case for public engagement and in the involvement of civil society in climate action. And other speakers will be talking about some of the more specific aspects and projects they're involved with. So I've titled my talk, Climate Action Needs People. Why does climate action needs people? Well, firstly, because the climate crisis can't be tackled with technology or top-down decision-making alone. Even if it could, technology such as electric cars needs adopting by people, and policy needs a mandate from people. But more substantially, because the climate crisis affects all of us, people have a right to be involved, and also doing so can lead to better outcomes. So in terms of citizen involvement on climate action, we have the chance to push for more ambitious and fairer responses. Now, public engagement, citizen engagement can be a bit of an ambiguous term, but in my view, what this means is any and all involvement of citizens in enabling climate action. Now, there's various ways that this can happen. First of all, this can take the form of participation in formal or organised processes. So through the UNFCCC, this includes what's known as Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE for short. And this is designed to enable wider involvement of civil society through things like education and awareness raising. There's also been a lot of interest, particularly in recent years, in the potential for citizens' assemblies to address the climate crisis. So these are processes designed to enable people's informed views to inform policy and principles for climate action. So we've done some work on this in the CAST Centre, and others too, such as the Global Assembly, are bringing citizens together in this way. Now, public engagement also includes communication to and with people about climate change. So one example of a project I've been involved with is the Climate Communication Project, where we did various things, but we worked with local groups on creative interpretations of their responses to climate change, as well as identifying some principles for good climate communication. I think there also remains a very important role for lifestyle and behaviour change to limit emissions, particularly in the case of people in the rich world. So part of responding to the climate crisis, part of citizen engagement is about living sustainably and changing our own circumstances. And we've written about this need for lifestyle change and ways in which it might be accomplished in a chapter in last year's UNEP emissions gap report, which is shown here. Public engagement can also include civil society and community-based projects. So in the CAST Centre, we've drawn together good examples of how this can be done at the grassroots level through our Stories of Change project. And this included initiatives such as repair cafes and sustainable food projects. And I've shown another example here as well, which is a campaign by our CAST Centre partners, an NGO called Possible, which has set out to encourage people to walk or cycle rather than drive. Now, of course, there's been a big rise in protest and activism on the climate crisis in recent years, and is arguably, I think, one of the most direct ways in which citizens can be involved in pushing for climate action. Now, this has had major impact on public opinion and political will through putting pressure on policymakers. So it's a very important part of public engagement, in my view. Now, all of these different approaches essentially recognize that citizen involvement is essential for bringing about change. And I think citizen involvement is not separate from, it's not some sort of optional add-on. In fact, it has to be part of transformative climate action. So linking and interacting across different scales. And we tried to show this in the following way in the UNEP emissions gap chapter I mentioned. So what is often thought of as more personal and immediate factors, things like people's attitudes, choices, and lifestyles, we believe have the potential to influence and in turn are influenced by things at the level of society, such as social movements, cultural norms, our relationships with other people. And in turn, these interact with more structural and systemic change, such as the political, economic, and policy choices. And so that was a brief run through, an overview of public and citizen engagement. I hope I've been able to give a flavour of that, and I'm now going to hand over to Rob, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. So we're delighted to be joined by Rob Venderbos and Mensah Sapiel Bobadilla. They are youth leaders from the Sustaining All Life and United to End Racism. They are a grassroots peer counselling organisation that uses tools of listening to support climate activists to heal from the emotional burdens of the climate crisis and oppression. Mensah is an Indigenous artist and activist from North America, from the Passamaquoddy tribe, and Rob is a climate activist and ecology student from the Netherlands who is aiming to activate and mobilise a large diversity of everyday people to join the climate movement. And they're both going to speak to us now, so over to you.
Hello, everyone. I just wrote a message to all the older adults on how to engage young people in climate action. So young people are at the forefront of climate action. This is because the future is what the rest of our lives is going to be. As young people, we have a lot to give because we have a unique and more helpful perspective of the world. But often in our lives, our voices aren't being listened to because sometimes our perspectives are different, so different that adults have a hard time understanding them. And we as young people are viewed as inexperienced and naive, which is very untrue. We have plenty of good ideas to give, and compared to adults, our minds aren't as clouded with a lot of the hopelessness and years of disappointment that often hold people down. So we are able to dream bigger and think with more creativity. But because of this belief that young people don't understand the complexities of the world, young people have to go through many obstacles just to have our voices be listened to. Things like oppressions are used as tools to keep us quiet. In order to engage with young people from around the world, we need to get rid of these barriers. If you have the power to include young people in any events as an equal, or education, or important discussions, you have to do what you can to make leading accessible to them, because our voices are just as important as everyone else's. We already know what we need to do to make the world a better place. We just need to be given more opportunities to lead, and adults need to learn how to be more open-minded to follow the ideas of change demanded by the leaders of our generation.
I'm also going to speak about including young people and mobilizing young people. I agree with Mensah, we are already at the forefront of the climate movement. And young people have always been at the forefront of every progressive movement. More knowledge and solutions would be useful, but we know enough. We know that it's time for action, and we know that we need to act now. Climate change is really a humanitarian crisis. People are getting hurt, and it's people who are losing their land. So we need human solutions. Mensah and me decided to share our time here because we want to show that we stand together and that we always stand together, not alone. Racism, sexism, other oppressions, injustice in the world needs to be addressed for humankind to be working together. Young people are really good at human solutions. I want to talk about language. Policymakers and scientists' language is very different from how humans actually talk. It's not how young people talk. It's not how working people talk. If you want to work with young people, with indigenous people, with working people, you need to be open. You need to be honest. If you make a mistake, you need to apologize, and then we can move on together. And very important, you need to listen. All humans are in this together, and it's a really scary time to be alive. So we need a place to come together and listen to each other, because we need the space to address these emotions that are coming up. Talking about engaging young people. You can tell a 3-year-old about climate change. It's not too hard a concept. You just need to find the words and the time. After you tell a child about climate change, you need to be there to listen to them, and you need to be there to support them with whatever they come up with, whatever action they want to take. It is time to listen. It is time to listen to young people. It is time to listen to people from the global south. It is time to listen to indigenous people. It's time to listen to women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Robin Prest, who is Programme Director at the Maurice J. Wask Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The centre uses dialogue and engagement to facilitate transformative conversations and create real-world impact for society's most pressing challenges. Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Carlene. If I could just have the clicker there.
Sorry.
Thank you. All right, so we're here in Glasgow launching the International Climate Engagement Network as part of the work we're doing at the Maurice J. Wask Centre for Dialogue. And before I dive into that presentation, I just wanted to look over Robin Mensah's. I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old back at home in Vancouver. And it's interesting, Rob, with what you just said, because I think about explaining climate change to my children. It actually kind of terrifies me because I don't know what to say back. So thank you for that. That makes it very real. There's a couple different worlds I've seen here in Glasgow. This is the first time that I've attended a COP myself. Of course, we have the very vocal, and rightfully so, world outside the blue zone, where people are calling on governments to act more quickly and talking about the impacts that they're feeling within their communities even today. Inside the blue zone, I think there's also a perspective that exists as far as a decision maker who might feel sometimes stuck within a box to do with public opinion or technology or financing or the partisan politics that exists back home, the brinkmanship of who goes first. And that decision maker can be pushing on the boundaries of those boxes to expand the constraints. What we don't often see in the dynamics in these spaces, though, are the people around the world, whether it's Tokyo or Mexico City, Mumbai or Accra, who are living their lives, may not be entering by the frames of climate change within the conversations that they have, may be fearful of action, may be fearful of inaction in different ways. And what we lack in these spaces, I've heard so many times on the stage, people say that we need to listen to the people, but there's so little conversations about how we actually do that. And so it becomes a platitude rather than something that's actually actioned. Within the context of COVID, that gives me great fear. We're around 18 months into, or perhaps 2 years into a global pandemic, and we've seen a cleavage in society where we no longer have consensus within all aspects of society for how to proceed. We see this is an anti-mask rally in my hometown of Vancouver. And I think about the next 3 decades of climate action. How do we sustain public will? How do we, in the presence of emergencies, of fires and floods and all the different pressures, and psychological impacts, the trauma, how do we maintain public will against that fear? So engagement doesn't have to slow down action. This is a really important point. We can engage now about what we plan to do 2 years from now. We can start early. And by bringing together the values and lived experience of regular people, science and expertise, the advocacy of social movements, the accountability of leadership, those are all the tools that we need to be working together in conversation. And there's different types of climate engagement that we've identified in the report that we've just released that are useful to think about in shifting those systems. There's place-based engagement, which is our ways of bringing together, making climate feel real to people by planting trees in their neighborhood or taking other actions that really show them, connect them to the impacts of climate change in their daily lives. There's relationship-based methods where you work in partnership with groups, especially those who are going to be impacted by climate change, to advance work together. Deliberative processes, as Stuart was talking about, that allow the public to learn and come to informed judgment with actionable recommendations, and large-scale processes that can co-create narratives with the wider population and shift those public opinion constraints that might exist on decision makers in a way that's still deeply democratic. And by working at those different levels of engagement and levels of the system, that's how you create systems change. And we're seeing processes like this around the world. We're seeing crowdsourcing climate vulnerability assessments in Indonesia. We're seeing work in Kenya and Uganda to partner with women to build more resilient lifestyles and more resilient economic systems, farming and otherwise. We're seeing green participatory budgeting now spreading in many, many countries, dozens of countries around the world, where communities are given resources themselves to allocate for how to take action against climate change. We're seeing processes in my own hometown, Vancouver, where universities are marshaling hundreds and thousands of students to design solutions for the challenges that city planners say that they're struggling with. We see climate assemblies. And as we try to shift the system, the tools within that system that make engagement work include accountability. So having decision makers close the loop to say how they've used what they've heard, or if they haven't acted, why that is. Centering equity in those voices who are going to be most impacted by climate change. Creating iteration so that these groups are speaking to each other and responding to each other rather than having input go into a black box and the adults put the kids to bed and then go away and make a decision, as the model sometimes feels like now to residents and citizens. And thinking of engagement as something that is sustained, not just a single process that ends in a year, but something that is sustained to grow over the coming decades. So can public participation accelerate the transition to net zero? Yes. And it can do that by reducing misinformation, improving the quality of decisions, and maintaining public confidence through those decades ahead. So, thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Okay, so we're going to take a little time now to gather questions or thoughts from the audience. I think do you also have a slide that has the Slido link on it? So if you're watching online, you can send us a question on here. There's also a way that you can do that and it will magically appear on this iPad beside me. So if you're watching either way online and you'd like to put a question or a comment, either use the Slido or the official UN system. But if you would like to make your way to a microphone, if you have a question or something you would like to share about your challenges in your context of engaging citizens in this transformation. I know it's late, but we have one enthusiastic volunteer. So, Michael.
Yes, good evening. Thanks very much for the first round. I'm Michael Small. I'm a colleague of at Robbins at the Center for Dialogue. But I'd like to ask our two youth participants, I'll call you that, because I've momentarily forgotten your organization. I'm not sure if either of you have taken part in one of these gatherings before, but I'd be very interested to hear a little more about what's your experience been, either one or both of you, as young people coming into a number of different spaces, not just this one tonight, but other events that you may have attended this week, and how that may have changed or reinforced any perceptions you had about what young people have to contribute and what the rest of us should be listening to young people.
Yeah, so I think my experience here has it's been very terrifying to be here, especially as a younger person in this very older adult world. So sometimes it's hard for me to feel like I have something to give by being here. But I am here to represent young people so that they can have a voice.
Well, this is my 4th or 5th COP. And what I see every year again is that there's a lot of people sleeping, listening, and not really listening to the negotiations. And the only people I see having fun in this place, really, is young people. And you need fun to stay awake with these things. And you need fun to stay present while facing such horrifying risks, horrifying prospects. And the fun and connection young people can bring to such a place, I think that's vital. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more? Yes, please.
Hello, Alan Amerkanyan from the American University of Armenia. I live in a country where climate change is not widely appreciated as a global challenge, and it is people live with a great deal of anxieties, everyday life and economic, ability to survive economically. And so how would any recommendations how to constructively engage citizens where you don't want to add additional levels of anxiety to their lives and stress because they will run away, they will not come to you? How do you constructively engage citizens to think about solutions that they would find viable and doable? Sorry, it's a very general question, but it's a reality for a lot of people in the world, yeah?
It's a great question, exactly the sort of thing we were looking for, so thank you very much. Who would like to come back on that question? Stuart and Robin?
I can have a go. Yeah, it's a brilliant question and a really important one and a really difficult one. I mean, I think for me, I think we have to be careful not to think of panaceas, but from my point of view and the work we do in the CAST Centre, well, our sort of tagline is how can we live differently and better while meeting the need for rapid emissions reduction? And really, you know, a lot of the conversations that take place here at COP are about finance or reducing emissions or ambition or this or that. But really at the root of what we all want as people, as citizens, is to live a good, happy, safe life. And I think it's about trying to find ways, you know, whether that's sort of in a participatory way or a grassroots way, to try and craft that future in a way which doesn't, well, you can put it in either order, doesn't wreck the climate or the biosphere, and is also means people can live a happy and rewarding life. And the frustration for me, I think, is those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can live a good, happy life in a low carbon way. And so I think, you know, crafting this message that it's not just about we must respond to the doom and get rid of the emissions. Yes, that's important, but that there is actually something positive we are trying to aim for, I would think. And I use we in the sort of broadest sense.
Thanks, Stuart. Would anyone like to add anything to that? Yeah.
So what I think is really important is community. You really have to look to each other to find hope and support. And when you work together, your voices and your power is much stronger than when you're separate. So when you have a really strong sense of community, I think you could do a lot more.
Thank you. Elodie, I believe you have a couple of questions from Slido.
Yes, we have quite a few actually coming in related to trust. So apologies to our viewers online. I'm going to try to combine these questions together. What can we do to build trust and engagement in action? Which stakeholders are trusted the most? And related to that, how do you manage the loss of trust that happens when citizens are engaged, yet when the adults meet it's never as discussed. And somebody commented, it seems our leaders aren't really listening to the public. How can we make them listen and take bolder action? So very related questions around trust.
Thank you, Elodie. So if anybody would like to pick up on whichever elements of that, over to you.
One of the first things to make people feel that they're part of a conversation is to feel witnessed. And so the relationship between citizens and residents and governments really in some ways is no different than the dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics around a family's table. If I say that I've had a hard day, I want somebody around that table to ask me, well, what happened? And I will feel listened to if that person reflects back that they've heard what I've said. And if I say that I need help, let's say that I need a ride to the train station to get out of Glasgow, and somebody just ignores me, that's going to make me feel hurt or like I'm not part of a community. Whereas if somebody says, well, I would love to do that, but I'm speaking at this other event, let's try to find another solution, then even though they didn't give me the ride, I feel like I've been heard, and I feel like that person cares about my well-being. And it's really that simple, I think, when it comes to the role of governments in engaging with people. I think that governments need to make people feel seen, take their concerns seriously and refer back to them, and explain why they've acted and how they've used the input they've heard to inform those actions. And it's when I say it like that, it sounds like another platitude, except that it so rarely happens in our government decision-making processes, and yet it's such a basic, fundamental human quality.
Thank you. Mark, I'm aware you haven't come in on any of these. If you want to, I won't force you to do that right now, but if you want to, I'll come back to you. Would anyone else like to comment to any of the questions coming in from remote participants? Stuart, on you go.
Say a couple of points, sort of scribbling down some notes. I mean, trust is really important. Actually, I was talking to some people about this earlier. There are, the trouble with politicians, I think in many countries around the world, is they're among some of the least trusted people there are. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for less good reasons. There are the good politicians and bad. I think one of the hopes for me from these more participatory approaches, like citizens' assemblies, is that they do have the potential to be more inclusive. If they're done right, and if they're not done as a sort of phony consultation, and they can genuinely enable a process whereby people's voices are heard. So we heard from Mensah that it's no good just to say, what are your views without that having a way to be taken seriously and incorporated into processes. So I think I feel like some of the things we're talking about, setting up genuine processes whereby people's voices can come through, itself is valuable for climate action, and it also has the potential to build trust. I mean, I think we've had in the UK, Scotland, Germany, France, now several countries have been citizens' assemblies, and these have been really quite small scale, not hugely well-funded processes. In France, there's quite a lot of money went in, but they really had quite a galvanizing effect that, what's the word? Not ordinary people, but not the elite. The not elite then became part of the process, and I think that inclusive process is really important. I'll leave it there.
We could ask what are leaders. I think leaders are people who do what is necessary, and therefore any cleaner is a leader, and some politicians might not be at all. How do we make politicians do what they need to do? It's partly to keep them responsible for what needs to happen. And we need to go out on the street with lots of people. And it has shown that societal change comes really only when enough people take to the streets and demand or are very clear that it's time to change, and the time is now.
Thank you. We're going to go to our next set of speakers now. So we're joined by Purnamita Dasgupta from the International Centre for Integrated Mountain Development. The centre is focused on regional intergovernmental learning and knowledge sharing, and I hope that she can join us now. Purnamita, I think you may need to unmute. Welcome.
Hello and good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Delighted to be here.
Purnamita, I think you may be muted again. Yeah. Can she hear me? Purnamita, I think you're muted again. Yeah, you're still muted. Should we try this again? This feels very Zoom working.
If we should just play the video because we don't think.
Okay, we have a backup of a video that Purnamita made, so we're going to try and play that now. If you bear with us for a second.
Good evening. My name is Purnamita Dasgupta and I work with the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. ICIMOT is a regional intergovernmental center with 8 member countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal and Pakistan, devoted to the sustainable development of the mountains and people in the Hindu Kush Mountains. It is an extremely biodiverse region, and its river basin supports some of the most culturally diverse populations. This is also a region where change impacts are felt with melting of glaciers and increasing disaster risks. Most of the economies here were badly hit by the pandemic, and recovery plans, though well in place, are focused on rebuilding lives and livelihoods at the earliest. What happens here affects 1/4 of humanity. Climate resilience in the current context is achievable only through intense community engagement. This region is highly prone to floods, which impact lives and livelihoods of literally millions. A low-cost, people-centered system to detect and respond to floods was developed with communities and government-run agencies, where a trained caretaker upstream is responsible for dissemination of information downstream through a network of communities, providing sufficient lead time to prepare and respond to the flood. First pilot in India. This flood warning system has been subsequently adopted in Afghanistan, Nepal and Pakistan, and more recently Malawi, Africa. An assessment of its implementation in Ratu demonstrated that this way of involving communities from conceptualization to operationalization resulted in strengthened upstream-downstream linkages and a great willingness among communities to help each other prepare for disasters. The second example is drawn from farming, since agriculture is a mainstay of many households in these remote and fragile landscapes, and climate vulnerability is extremely high. This is an example of co-developing and implementing a nature-based solution, a biofertilizer and biopesticide practice called Jolmol, which had been present, but now with science-backed inputs and evidence, could be upscaled and adopted more widely. What was important here was that though it seemed to be a foregone conclusion that context-specific, simple and affordable solutions work, it was equally important that the implementation was supported by the generation of science-based evidence that the economics works out. So the engagement actually cut across all categories of citizens. So actually, one had to do on-farm participatory research on the efficacy of tourism, which showed increased crop yield and less pest manifestation across a range of food crops. This was very important in creating the trust and confidence across stakeholders and persuading that this could be a feasible, viable way forward. It is being implemented at 24 sites in Nepal and is now being scaled up under the Organic Agriculture Program of the Government of Bhutan. I would like to end by reiterating that the cause of climate resilience is served best by leveraging cultural diversity, creating trust and confidence in modern science through more formal citizen science engagements. So the two are equally important and have to move in parallel. I leave you with ICIMOD's HKH campaign at COP26, which has a three-pronged strategy. The most important idea being to protect what we call the pulse of the Himalayas. Thank you.
Thank you, Purnamita, and apologies for a few technical problems there. I go now to our final speaker, who is Mark Byno from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre, also known as the 5 Cs. They support the people of the Caribbean in addressing the impacts of climate change and develop programs to deliver sustainable development opportunities. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, moderator, and good evening to those who have stuck it out with us. The Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre represents 14 sovereign states and 15 states in totality. As the Caribbean, many people often have the impression that we're all about sand, sea, and beaches, but there are certain common realities that we also confront. And I may be going slightly left field, but there are 3 things that we often advocate: policies, people, and partnerships. And I'm saying policies because oftentimes in the discussion regarding citizens' participation, we often forget that policymakers are also citizens. They may be making policies in one place, but they live somewhere else. And where they live may also be impacted by certain realities. The people aspect is vitally important because, as a previous presenter indicated, what we are aiming to do is to enhance the quality of life that our people face. And last but not least, we're doing this through partnerships. And the engagements have to be at various levels. It can be at a political level, so yes, we have to be speaking about ambition, about the financing gap, about issues that are at that higher level. We also have to be speaking at the mid-level in terms of the technicians, the scientists, those who are bringing the information to us, and then at the lower level, how do these translate into practical actions that we are not just speaking to ourselves, but we are speaking to those whose lives matter most. This evening, I will focus on 2 projects that the center would have carried out. The first is what we call Yache. It's an indigenous community made up largely of 35 families, half of which are female-headed. And they came to us because they were trying to secure their livelihood. What do we mean by that? Other communities were coming in from neighboring countries and encroaching upon lands which they would have previously used. The center, in collaboration with this entity, this community, approached the government of Belize, where we were able to secure 760 acres of leased whole land within a forest reserve, the first time that happened. We then worked with them to establish a system of mixed agriculture, or what is popularly known elsewhere maybe as agroforestry. What you're seeing here is an expansive amount of seedlings, the cacao plant. They're also involved in other permanent crops. And we went so far as to provide them seed money to purchase a vehicle to get the crops from the field to the market. Importantly, we have invested heavily, and I say we, meaning the center, in early warning systems. And when we speak about these, it's not just at the esoteric level, but the farmer is interested, for example, in knowing when I should plant, what crops I should plant, how long I should plant for, so that when we begin to see indicators of whether a dry season is coming on, they can ultimately be advised, and so do not be involved in a useless activity. Lessons learned is that development with nature is possibly the best option that we have available to us. So it's not a false choice of either or, it's one with. Mixed approaches spread risk, and they do build resilience. And communities buy-in and ownership is important. Someone said earlier, listening. I think at these fora, we talk too much and we listen too little. And it doesn't have to start only at the community level. It has to start with us being able to appreciate what each other would have to say. The second project is one in Petit Martinique in the island of Grenada. Now, 8 of the 32 most water-scarce islands are found in the Caribbean. So importantly, we have to be looking at water security as a vital element of building resilience. Again, in these 4, you hear the dichotomy often established, adaptation or mitigation. We believe adaptation with mitigation in a small island context builds resilience and do allow for greater impact. So we spoke with the community, roughly of 100 households. But what was interesting about this particular example was that they were able to come together and advise where the project ought to be sited, where the outlet ought to be, both the inlet and the outfall outlet, simply because the community is known largely for fishing. And where we previously had perceived to install the outlets would have been in conflict with the local fishermen. Additionally, most of the land on this island are owned by private citizens. And so it was important to get them on site. So bringing 100 households to determine how we wouldn't only build a saltwater reverse osmosis system using renewable energy in the form of photovoltaics, but also establishing the distribution network was an absolute achievement for us. The outcomes were enhanced water security, revision to the energy policy because we oversupplied energy, so the excess fed into the grid. The company there, the electric company, was willing to change its policy towards a net metering policy. That's why I'm saying, don't only think of citizens in terms of people on the ground. That policy now has benefited not only that community, but others, and ownership and buy-in from the populace. So what we are seeing are real changes in real lives with real people. And these were able to be accomplished through first looking at the policies we have, creating the right environment, the people that we're working for. We should be seen as servants of the people and not see ourselves as their lords. And last but not least, the partnerships, whether through private sector, public sector, or community organizations. I thank you.
Maggie, thank you so much. And great to have some positive, specific examples of engagement making projects better and communities better, as well as reducing emissions and increasing resilience. I don't know if it is possible to get Purnamita back so that she could answer questions. Yes, it is. Fantastic. So, over to you for questions or reflections on engagement in your own context. Do feel free to move to one of the mics. If not, I'll start just asking you questions, but great, thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's been really great to hear from you. And I'm thinking about the idea of engagement, which I think is something that this panel is very based around, engaging communities, engaging people in climate solutions. And I'm curious about the idea of engagement. I work with youth, And youth are often people that people decide should be engaged with. And often that engagement is fairly shallow. And it also assumes that people are not already engaged. And I really appreciated, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name.
Mark,
what you just said about listening. And I think that Mensah and Rob also talked about that. So I'm curious, I'm curious about sort of shifting the idea of engagement possibly to supporting what communities, what youth, what people are already actually doing and what their needs are, and trying to listen to them. I'm wondering what you, Augie, or Mensah and Rob, or anyone else on the panel has experiences of how to listen and support communities with where they're already at and what they feel needs to happen, because I think that there are often, especially marginalized communities, that are already doing things. So how do we support that?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to come back?
Yes, if I may take a first shot at that. I see our role as facilitating and not dictating. At a recent forum we were at, the youth said that they're often invited to the party, but not allowed to dance. And so we want to give them an opportunity to dance their dance. Therefore, the engagement should start first in terms of what interests the youths most of all. Where do their interests really lie? And us being there to guide, not to dictate. That allows them to truly be able to unlock the full range of their potential. As the gentleman from Armenia mentioned, we do not want to pile on, because these are very stressful times even for young people. And so the idea is to find what they enjoy doing, and then infusing within that the elements of climate change, climate resilience. I think as Stuart mentioned, and he's right, in the final analysis, we should not be saying to people don't, but giving them alternatives in terms of what they should. Too often we're saying to young people, don't do this. In my time, in the good old days, this is how it used to be. This 2021, okay? And so it's important for us to understand where they're coming from and how best we can help them to achieve those goals. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to come in, either of you?
Yeah, what Mark said, I very much agree with. A friend of mine who's in his 50s decided to support any youth in his city that would be willing to engage with climate change, and he has just listened to what they want to do, and he has arranged permits. He has got in the way of any adults who wanted to tell them what to do, and just facilitate really what people need to do.
Thank you. Any other reflections?
Yeah, one thing I'll add is that often I think in the ways that institutions engage with young people and residents in general, there's also often an underappreciation of what is possible. And when I think about the post-secondary environment when I say that, and the fact that there are thousands of students every day who write an essay and put that essay in the recycling bin afterwards. And what an idea to actually have those students connect them with the real challenges of their community and have all that potential go towards something that actually is effective and creates real world impact. So there's all these different systems that we can shift that enable that agency. And then, yes, we can also see the agency that already exists, the processes, the ideas that already exist, and try to lean into those. I do think that there's a space and a challenge in that at the end of the day, the feeling of not being at the table to make the hard decisions or to move those decisions forward. In order to sit at that table, we need to create structures that let people hear from each other and understand each other's needs and perspectives and reconcile that. That's the essence of politics. And we're not good in this space at bridging those worlds. We're not good at bridging the energy, the ideas with the political spaces and treating everyone as adults and looking at the trade-offs and looking at the issues and the values that are going into those. And that really is the space that we need to enter if we're truly going to recognize each other. And nobody ever gets exactly what they want in that space, but it's a powerful space to move forward.
Thank you. Purnamita, I wonder if you would like to come in, and if you would, maybe you could give me a wave if you would like to, and then we'll see if we can hear you. Yes, okay, so please unmute and let's see if we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry about the technical glitch earlier. I was getting a message on my screen that said that the moderator had disabled my controls.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us now.
So I'm not sure what was happening. My apologies. I hope you were able to hear the recording.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think my co-panelists have already said much of what has to be said. So the only little bit of thing here that I wanted to also raise is that youth itself is not a homogenized entity. We also need to remember that. So to keep ourselves very conscious and alert about the diversity that exists, and to find ways to sort of be very inclusive of that diversity. And I'm thinking primarily from the context of a developing country, and I'm thinking of the very wide divergences between in lived experiences. So we actually have to find the space for youth itself to sort of have convergence in the way they think, and to be able to come across as a strong force to reckon with.
Thank you.
And equip them with the tools to do that. So and then they take it on and take it forward. And we've seen this in many movements for the environment, not just climate change, but in many movements for the environment in parts of South Asia. So thank you, that's all.
Thank you. Rob, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, I'd like to add something more. I was just thinking, it's good to realize, where do you think you feel smarter? Where do you want to take over? And be very aware of that. And that goes for any adult trying to support young people, any man trying to support women, any white person trying to support people of a global majority or indigenous people, any person from the global north trying to support people from the global south. Just be aware, where do you feel smarter? When do you think things are going too slow? And you just jump in and take away the space.
Thank you. Elodie, do you have some Slido things?
Yes, we have quite a few questions. I'll start with the first one at the top here. Climate engagement, as evident in this COP process as well, is usually overwhelmingly white. Any ideas on building a more inclusive process without tokenization?
Okay, can you say the last bit again? A more inclusive process?
Without tokenization.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that? Well, if this question is great.
Well, what I noticed a lot in leadership is there's always somebody who's considered a leader in a high position, and it's usually a white person. And even if they're an ally of indigenous people or people of the global majority, that they kind of speak on behalf of that group of people, where they should be using their platform as an amplifier for the people's voices.
Thank you. Elodie, do you want to give us one more?
Sure. Citizen engagement often needs to be place-based for people to talk about what they care about. how can these local conversations be accomplished globally?
Okay, so the link from local engagement to the sort of global level challenge. Would anybody like to, Mark? Do you want to?
If I take the first question, I'm not going to get into a race debate here, but we have to start with the fundamentals. Most developing countries cannot afford to send 15 or 16 members delegation. So that's a given. We within the Caribbean, under the UNFCCC framework, we allocated 2 persons or 2 negotiators per country that the UN system would pay for. Any additional number would have to be financed out of the pockets of the government. Being at COP is not cheap. We're staying in Edinburgh, so we're spending 4 hours per day, round trip if not more. The prices are astronomical for hotels. So the system is already stacked against how much can poor countries be present. When you take that to the next level of we're coming here year after year after year, and you're hearing pledges, but implementation tends to be slow, the populace out there who have not fully grasped the significance of a COP are asking questions, and this is where citizens' engagement comes in again. Why are you continuously going to the pilgrimage to come back with more promises, and even those which were made previously were not implemented? So we have to look at the entire system, and not just to see the results, but to be able to understand the process which has gotten us here. I'll just rest it there for now.
Thank you. Anyone like to add anything? Yeah?
I'll just say that I think it's important to acknowledge those truths. And I think all of us on the stage have a responsibility, especially those of us who come from backgrounds of privilege, to witness and acknowledge the truth of that statement. So I want to make sure to do that. And certainly coming from Canada, where we've contributed far more than our fair share of greenhouse gas emissions in the past, that is something that we have to be conscious of in the spaces that we occupy and the airspace that we take up. If I had the ability to plan how COPs were organized, I think that COPs in the future should only take place in those most affected countries to the extent that they wish to host them, just for those reasons of accessibility. And frankly, people like me need to see the places that are being affected so that it's not just an abstract concept.
So that's a very specific suggestion on it. I just wonder, Mark, if you, from what you said, if there's any kind of, if you feel like there's appetite to address that inequality in the process that you've identified. You know, you can see that there are these problems and you experience those, but do you feel like there is an understanding of that and a commitment to challenge it?
And I would say no, quite frankly. We've had the opportunity of dealing with bilaterals, multilaterals, and quite often, even when you are putting forward a project proposal and you are couching the issues, those who are reading the proposal seem not to get it. Sometimes you are forced to invite them to actually come, and when they're on the ground, as my colleague said, then they get it. So in actual fact, when we speak about deeper cuts in ambitions, and I like to say here, as a matter of fact, 1.5 will not be a painless solution for the Caribbean and for many small island states. We have had issues where a single Category 3 hurricane wiped out 200% of a country's GDP. Now, how are you going to get back? The cliche building back better sounds good. It doesn't apply to us. We are struggling to just build back. So when you start talking about getting better, before you start building, another comes along. And so the little gains that you have made, those are wiped out. We went to a huge conference in 2017 to the UN, where pledges were made for countries like Dominica that had 215% of their GDP wiped out. On average, the Caribbean is losing 7% per annum. And those are just the direct costs that we're talking about, okay? When you place that in the context of recession, it's like the Caribbean is in perpetual recession. So in actual fact, we are living these realities at a 1.2 degrees Celsius. What happens when it gets to 1.5? And what happens with the trajectory of 2.7? So in actual fact, if it is affecting those at the higher echelons, also imagine what is happening to those lower down. And so when we speak about climate change and environmental issues, that is why the focus is not just on impacts, but on resilience. Do you have the capacity to bounce back? And most communities are adversely impacted in this way. So I support you fully. Come down to the Caribbean. And even if it means that some of the hotels are not as posh as you would want them to, the transportation doesn't work well, you have potholes on the roads, that will be some of the realities which you'll begin to understand, which we have to live with on a yearly, daily, and monthly basis.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. I'm just reminding the panel that in a moment I'm going to come to them for their one take-home. And it's not one of those panels where your one take-home is actually 8 take-homes. It's one take-home. So just to have that in your mind. I believe we had a question here. Sorry, I made you stand for a long time.
No, that's okay. I don't want to take away if there's a question from, because I've got a bit of a comment just to pick up on something.
We'll make your comment and then we'll take some from Slido too.
I'm happy to speak on behalf of some students I taught 2 years ago, and it would be much better if they were here to report their success, but they're not. So I'm going to take the advantage of the fact that I am here, because I'm picking up on your comment of what it's all about community. I had the privilege of teaching for a semester an intensive course on climate change for a group of Canadian students who were very close to you in age. Really, the purpose of the course was to give people a sense of not only a knowledge of the subject matter, but an ability to speak and to engage and to convene people. And the final exercise for that course was that the students were given complete freedom to organize a public dialogue. They could pick the topic. I was very proud of the title they came up with, and I think it's really, both the title and the subtitle I think was very appropriate for this whole panel. And their title speaks directly to the comment that you made a few minutes ago, because they called their dialogue "Can't Face It Alone." And that was their way, in a sentence, of capturing both the anxiety and the solidarity that they were striving for as people your age. And their subtitle was Climate Action Beyond the Individual, which is not just can't face it alone in the sense of solidarity, but we have to come together in communities. It was highly successful. They brought together 150 people, and the people were of all different ages. There were younger people than them, often siblings of theirs, but also younger folks in the community, teenagers and school students, and people of lots of different age groups. And the students organized it around different communities of interest, arts, culture, food, things that people in our city could relate to. I won't go through more of the details, but it was really, really effective. And it had that energy because it was organized by young people. They entirely facilitated it. It brought out a large crowd. And it demonstrated the convening power that people of your age have if they have both the opportunity and the confidence and the space to do so, and the receptiveness of other generations to do that. So I just want to share that little bit of insight and build on the contribution that you gave us a few minutes ago.
Thank you. Elodie, can I take a question or a comment from Slido? Just one, please.
Yes. Is there a role for the business, private sector to play in supporting engagement? And if so, what is it?
Okay, great. So I'll take anyone who wants to come to that comment. Is there a role for business in this engagement that we're calling for? Mark, you're nodding. Do you want to?
Yes. Just quickly, the example I gave in Grenada, the power company is actually a private sector company. So to allow for that water security project to really be successful, they had to change their policy to allow for net metering to take place. And so that in itself is part of the opportunity. I think particularly for small island states, we have to get away from this segregation and the kind of isolation. You are public, you are private. We are operating in one space, and we need each other. So yes, there is the opportunity for private sector. We need to define what that scope will be, whether as venture capitalists, whether as service providers, whether as supporting certain initiatives. And when that is defined, I find that they're often willing to be at the table having that discussion.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that? Purnamita, would you like to? I think that might be a no. Would anyone else on the... Yes, Purnamita, would you like to comment on that question?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so I will move now to our one take-home message. And I'll just go along the panel this way, if that was okay. So, Stuart, what's your take-home from this evening?
Okay, I'm only allowed one, aren't I?
You're only allowed one.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that's come up a few times, including from one of the audience members, and I think that's the engagement or participation or whatever you want to call it is not something you do to people, but something you do with people and among groups together. You know, actually, it's relevant to this session because when we were talking about organising our public engagement session, we said, well, we need to actually talk with people in the audience. And then we saw our room, which is this sort of vast, almost designed to not have interaction. So we've done our best on that. But yeah, I think the points are very well made, that it's about making sure that everyone has a space, that you understand where people are coming from. And that can be easier said than done, I think, for those of us who like our PowerPoint slides and do our talks from a stage. So yeah, it's a good thing to take home, I think.
Thank you. Rob?
You want to say it? Or shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. So we came up with what our take-home message is together.
Excellent.
It's very simple. Young people are at the forefront of the climate movement, and you should listen.
Thank you. Robin?
There's a project we're launching in on with the city of Burnaby and Van City back home in Metro Vancouver right now. And one of the really exciting pieces that we agreed upon that's not normal within that context or typical is we agreed that we were going to identify the people in the community who were most impacted by climate change. And then when the city developed its official community plan, it would say what the policy options were and how they would affect those different types of people. Becoming more and more common in Canada under the gender-based analysis framework, but really such a basic thing as saying who's affected and how will our policies affect them, and publishing that information before a decision is made can be one of those small but transformative actions.
Thank you. Purnamita, can I come to you for your one take-home?
Yes. Well, there's several, but the key one for me is really about realizing that citizens, as Mark said, it's not just about the local, which is something we tend to do in a lot of our policies and our program designs. But citizens cut across all walks of life, and they come from very, very different perspectives, and we have to keep promoting equity in the dialogue among citizens on climate resilience. So promoting equity in the way we listen and in the way we are willing to hear and participate is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark, that leaves you for your final take-home.
Yes, I was going to cheat, but somebody saw my paper and tore it up. I was going to go right back from where I started, where our motto is empowering people to act on climate change. Now, for me, that is essential. Whether you empower them through access to information, access to resources, access through dialogue, access through South-South cooperation, let them have the resources that are required to make the decision in their own best interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the close of our event. Thank you very much for joining us. I think for me, you know, the stressing of the amount that we need to listen and It's been a pleasure to listen to you all this evening, and we all have this incredible opportunity for the remainder of the week to listen here at COP. So I thank you all very much. I thank you very much for your time to come this evening and stay so late, and I wish you all safe travels home. Thank you.